It's good stuff. And it's free.
Check, check. You can hear me all right? Look at this magnificent barn.
So Nick, I wanted to start today by asking you a little bit about your journey into comedy. And what is it that pushed you towards acting? And why were you drawn towards the arts in the first place?
That's a great question. I grew up in a small town in Illinois, which is right in the middle of America, which is west of here. And I grew up in the 70s and 80s, long before the internet, in a pretty poor household. So we didn't even have cable television. We got a VCR at one point, and we had 6 movies, 5 of which were musicals. And so nobody in my entire sphere, my entire community, had ever gone into the arts. And I grew up this precocious kid. There's a famous, in my family, there's a famous home movie, I was about age 12, of me, somebody's taking an 8mm movie of the family on vacation, and everybody's kind of shy and avoiding the camera, and then it gets to me, and I'm just doing this awkward, horrible dance, as if to say, if you're rolling a camera, you want to get a load of this shit right here. And only later, you know, for years I was embarrassed by it. And then once I found out that you could study theater in college, and I said, oh, I think that's what I want to do. I want to entertain people. And my entire community said, you can't do that. You can't get there from here. And I said, by God, I think I can. Those actors must come from someplace. And so I got into theater school, and only then did I look back and realize that I had always had this penchant to make people laugh or to make them have a catharsis, which means shit yourself. I don't know if you guys study Latin. So I mean, it really was an organic impulse. I I had a lot of catching up to do once I got to college, and my cooler friends that had grown up with culture literally handed me things, and this is the late 80s, like the Beatles. And I said, these guys are great. Like, I think they're going somewhere. And so I started catching up as quickly as I could when I realized, oh, I can get work entertaining people, but I have a lot of catching up to do, and that was 20 years ago, and I'm still catching up as fast as that's 30 years ago. I'm still catching up.
So following on from that, so your early career, as you said, was dominated by the theatre in and around Chicago. But I wondered now, do you miss the stage, and would you ever consider going back to your roots?
I do miss the stage, but I do still work in theater. I used to be full-time theater, and then my wife and I met. If you're not familiar, my wife is named Megan Mullally. She played. I agree. She's Karen on Will and Grace, and she's Tammy too on Parks and Rec. And not everybody knows, she's also the funny sister with the cats named Gail on Bob's Burgers. That's the peak of the conversation. She and I met doing a play in 2000, and we then did several more plays at this company. We did a play together, I think 5 years ago in LA, and then took it to New York. And then 3 years ago, I had the great pleasure of adapting the comedy novel A Confederacy of Dunces to the stage in Boston. So I do still pursue the stage. The tricky part is, in the film business particularly, the good jobs, you need to book them 6-8 months in advance. And so you're always booked up, and then somebody calls and says, hey, you want to come play Hamlet? I get asked that all the time. You wouldn't believe. And I say, no, let me give you Benedict's number. And I heard he did a fine job.
He did. Then I wondered if I could turn to your most popular performance. As a woodworker, saxophonist, and staunch libertarian, there are several obvious parallels between you and Ron Swanson. So I wondered, where does Ron begin in the line between Ron and Nick end?
I wish I had my guitar. My last tour, which will be coming to a broadcast channel somewhere at some point, the show ended with a song called I'm Not Ron Swanson. And I'll quickly recite it for you. I understand you've come to love another man. He's studly and heroic, so I completely understand. But now your expectations are a little high, I fear, because if I had to live like him, I'd be dead within a year. He can eat a big-ass steak for every single meal. His colon is fictitious, while mine is all too real. And his scotch intake would be my liver's doom, because mine is controlled by nature and his by the whims of the writer's room. I mean, that's the general gist of it. Is Ron Swanson is 20 times the man that I am. No mortal man can be what he is. He's superhuman, but I'm the simpering ninny of my family. I have two sisters who can out chop firewood compared to me. They can pound me into the ground. So I'm much more effeminate, which has probably become clear to you and seeing me in person. I had 2 semesters of ballet. But I'm a human being. So Ron Swanson is staunchly dependable. He's an expertly written comedy character, and I'm complicated. I make a lot more mistakes. I'm more wishy-washy. I'm a human being. I'm not a libertarian. Libertarianism is dumb. It's wonderfully written, and it works perfectly as it needs to in the formula as a foil against Leslie Knope on our show. And the sort of core tenets of libertarianism are absolutely admirable, but obviously they can't work, is the problem. We've tried it. It just doesn't work. I love red meat, but I read something where it's proving to be not so great for the atmosphere, and that gives me pause. And I also want to live a long time, so I eat a lot of salad because I'm not in a comedy. I'm not trying to get a laugh with my diet. I like pooping regularly. Ron is terribly constipated. They never did that episode.
Then I wanted to ask just another follow-up question about the characters. The American identity seems to be firmly rooted in most notable characters you've played. So I wondered, do you see the American identity as central to who you are outside of your performances?
Well, gosh, the American identity, it's something that in this current climate is really sort of come under the microscope, I think. And I think I'm excited that we're coming closer and closer to the truth that the American identity is a very human identity. Sort of the exciting thing about America is that it's where we, Homo sapiens, have had the opportunity to be us as honestly as possible. in many ways the most advanced part of Western civilization, or where we've had the most swings at free choice. And the result of that, is in parts heroic and impressive and disgusting and rapacious and embarrassing, just like us. And so to my way of thinking, the American identity is a very human identity, and it's not necessarily something to be patriotic and, to say we're the greatest, because if we are the greatest, perhaps we've made the most money, but we've also shit our pants the most. And so you have to take both sides of the coin. And if that's the case, then I'm happy to represent the American identity. But it's something, when that country was founded, it was called the Great Experiment. And I really embrace that notion. I think as human beings, we'll always be prone to make mistakes. No matter how much we can perfect a system of governance. And so it's always going to be a learning experience, and I'm happy to be part of that. I think it's foolish to ever think we're done learning or to claim that anybody is the best at anything. We'll all never be the best, but hopefully as we continue to learn and evolve, everyone around the world will become more even. And that's the American identity that I enjoy. There are a great many Americans, the majority of us did not vote for the embarrassing turd that's in the White House. And I'm very grateful that, that we have our hearts in the right place, even though, we're all in this boat together where we're aware that climate change is this terrible danger, but we still flip on the air conditioning when we walk in the house, or I have more socks than I probably need. I have 8 pairs of socks. Who needs, who do I think I am, a Rockefeller?
And then, before opening up the questions to the audience, I just wanted to pivot away from art and politics and talk for a little bit of time about wood. So, what first got you excited about wood and woodwork, and why is it still one of your most predominant passions today?
I'm glad you asked. I grew up in a wonderful rural family. Many of them are farmers to this day. My family is hilariously salt of the earth. They all fall under these headings: teacher, librarian, nurse, paramedic, farmer. I think that's everybody, except for my brother, who is a brewer of craft beer. So he's the king of the family. But I come from this incredibly salt of the earth. My family are all public servants. And I grew up learning to use tools. Everybody, we had a huge garden. We're all carpenters and mechanics, and we can all mend our clothing, and we all know how to cook. And it was just a matter of self-reliance, It's a certain form of frugality that's born of the agrarian lifestyle. And it's a way to affordably live on a small income, but, live deliciously. And so I didn't know any better. And then I grew up and moved to the city to have an audience for my performing. And unbeknownst to me, consumerism was all the rage, where, I'm not kidding, my friends in Los Angeles, if they get a flat tire, they say, oh, my car is broken, I have to throw it away and get a new one. People no longer understand how to use tools and how to fix things and take care of their own homes. And so immediately, I learned that I could use my carpenter skills to make money. I built scenery. professionally through my 20s while I was trying to get acting jobs. And then in my late 20s, I sort of tricked myself. And I guess that's the answer to your question is I had moved to Los Angeles. It wasn't as healthy of a community to build scenery in as Chicago had been. And so I had my tools but no work to do. And some friends hired me to build a deck, a cabin in their yard. And so I was building in an old timber frame style where you're not using nails and screws, but you're making these joints, mortise and tenon joints, sort of like old Japanese temples are built. So I taught myself to build this joinery, and it's the first time that I used chisels and hand planes, and suddenly I realized that I was building the same joinery that was used in antique furniture, and it was really an epiphany where I had tricked myself through years of carpentry, and then this post and beam construction. I said, holy cow, and if I shrink this down and get some nice wood, I can build an heirloom dining table. And from that moment on, I've just been fascinated. I recognized it immediately as a discipline that consumes me. And I always say to people, how are things going at the shop? Or because I have a wood shop in Los Angeles, and I say, things are going well, it keeps me out of the pub. And they always laugh, and I say, it's funny, but I mean it. I recognized it as a healthy way of life. It's something, it's not unlike the feeling, I spent 2 weeks one time playing video games, and I lost those 2 weeks to the incredible dopamine rush of video games. And at the end of the 2 weeks, one was called Earthworm Jim, and one was called Banjo-Kazooie. And me and my friend, we beat both games, and it was so fun and indulgent, and we just ordered pizza every day and beat these games. And at the end of it, it was incredibly triumphant for all of 20 seconds. And then I said, oh my God, what did I just do for 2 weeks? And I've never played a video game since then, because I get the same feeling when I'm successfully altering the shape of a piece of wood, but when I'm woodworking, I feel like I'm playing a video game, but when I beat the game, when I finish, I have a table or a chair or something beautiful that serves a purpose that I can get paid for. And so I recognized it as something I can be involved in, and it will keep me healthy and out of the pub as long as my hands keep working. And so that's become my soapbox issue, is whenever I talk to audiences, I encourage everyone to find I think that everyone is talented at making something. The human condition has been, I think, so occluded by the information age and consumerism. We have all these wonderful luxuries and these crazy smartphones that are wonderful in so many ways, but our handwriting is going to hell. And the incredible human magic of your brain coordinating with what your hands can do, whether you're making lasagna or dining room tables, or you're a masseuse, or you're making dildos, or orgasms are something you can make with your hands, and you can be paid for this work. I always encourage people, no matter what your course of study is, there's something you can make with your hands that will enrich your life and keep you attached to the countless generations of people who went to all the trouble of figuring these things out. I bet they don't teach that here. Maybe at All Souls.
So with that, let's open up the questions to the audience. If you want to raise your hand, and then we'll get a microphone to you. Let's go to the hand on the back right-hand side, over there.
Hello, is it working? Yeah. Good evening, Nick.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for imparting all this knowledge, valuable knowledge to us. I'm going to go ahead and pick your brain a little bit more with a very deep, heavy, loaded question, which has philosophical, ethical, moral, scientific, some may even say carnal implications.
7 5/8 inches.
Right, so follow-up question.
That's girth.
And I'm sure you have many answers to this one. What is the favorite wood that you like working with?
That's a
And
great...
of course, why?
Same answer. It's a great question. One of the wonderful things about working with wood is such a magical and eldritch material. When you actually learn how the cells of trees behave, it's incredibly magical and satisfying. And depending on the tree species, the woods behave in different ways. They have different properties, strengths and weaknesses. So one of the most magnificent woods, which you have a great deal of here, this is a pine. This is a softwood, which is a lesser wood. I don't want to shit on this great room, but a lot of the paneling, I visited the chapel at Trinity College today, and the paneling in that room, if you want an example, is a beautiful quarter-sawn oak. Primarily white oak is, I think, the most heroic of woods. It's so substantial that Her Majesty's Royal Navy was built entirely of oak, 16, 18 inches thick. Those magnificent ships of the line were built of this wood, and you know, they were so solid that they would receive nicknames like Old Ironsides was one of the Civil War ships in America. That is one of the favorite woods of furniture makers and cabinet makers because it's incredibly beautiful, it's incredibly versatile, and just ridiculously strong. If you're building a canoe or a musical instrument, you don't want something quite so substantial. You want, for a canoe, for example, you want something with great tensile strength, but actually much lighter in weight. So a cedar or a spruce will serve you much more admirably. So it all depends on what you're making, but if I could only pick one wood, it would be American white oak. I'll tell you that right to your face. Several centuries ago, it may well have been British white oak, but you cut them all down to build the ships. So you can't really get the good stuff anymore.
Let's take another question. Yep, to the hand down here.
Thank you so much for sharing with us today. I'm a big fan of Ron Swanson, also of Tammy too. But perhaps the most exciting, the project that I'm most excited about is Look and See, the portrait of Wendell Berry. So I just was wondering if you could speak on what about Wendell Berry's works resonated with you and what we might glean from them today.
Wow, thank you. What's your name?
I'm Tori.
Tori, you, no matter what happens, you have won the evening. I had the great pleasure and privilege of helping produce a documentary about my favorite writer. His name is Wendell Berry. He's 84. He's a Kentucky farmer. And I'll tell you what, he writes essays and poetry and fiction, and his thing is, it makes sense. I've already sort of given you a bit of my worldview, and the reason he is who I most greatly emulate is because he's had the wherewithal to famously remain a simple farmer. So he grew up farming with horses, and when everybody started buying tractors, he said, things are going fine. I don't need to improve my situation just because there's this newfangled gadget that will allow me to plow more fields. And then he became a writer and sort of remained in a sort of Amish way. He remained in his place. He remained a staunch steward of his land in Kentucky, which is quite beautiful. It's rolling hills. It's not dissimilar from perhaps the Lake District. So, some beautiful forest, some beautiful farmland. And his point of view as a writer was to watch the world suddenly speed up around him and just sign up hand over fist for this rampant consumerism, like a fashion, where people, were suddenly buying things they didn't need because they were receiving glossy advertisements telling them to. And it's something that we've become so used to now, but there was a time in his youth, in the 40s and 50s, when that was a real challenge. The Industrial Revolution happened. He speaks very eloquently about this. And suddenly, our industry was able to produce all of these items so much more easily and cheaply than we ever had before. And they said, all right, we've made these kick-ass vacuum cleaners. Now how do we sell them to these to these people? And that's where advertising was born. And it's quite nefarious. If you go back and think about it, people were perfectly happy cleaning their floors, and advertisers came in and said, you don't deserve to clean your house. Put your feet up, ladies. Buy our newfangled vacuum cleaner. And they had to begin to sell us things. And one of the things I could never fathom is being a person working in advertising today. If I buy a pair of shoes hoping they'll last me for a couple decades, and sometimes I'll get 10 years out of them, but I buy things to last. And to have the job of trying to convince you to buy a new kind of toothpaste seems like the seventh circle of hell to me. Because if you have a product, if you have a soap that you use, why do you need a new kind of soap? And so Wendell Berry maintains this point of view and has let the world just completely pass him by. He wrote a very famous essay in the 90s about why he'll never use a computer. And he breaks it down to the point where it's what I was talking about earlier, where he says, even me on my farm here, I do have electricity, and so I'm complicit. I'm just as bad as the city dweller, depending on all the municipal programs. As soon as you run one wire to your household and send them money, you're saying, I'm giving you, the energy company, agency. I'm trusting that you will send me this electricity or this coal or whatever you're sending me. I'm trusting that you will show good stewardship, that you will treat the planet with fidelity while you're sending me what I need to fire up these light bulbs. And we all know that some of those companies did not pay the proper, or not paying the proper attention to taking care of our planet. And we've done great damage, and that's something we're coming aware of, and I will beg you, all of you who are younger and smarter than me, to save the planet from my generation. If there's anything I can leave you with tonight, it's that. Please clean up my mess. and I'm sorry for all of my socks. But I'm telling you, I hope I've become friends with Wendell Berry, and he and his family have a farming program. I don't know if you're aware, but in America, most of the agriculture has been taken over by huge industrial corporations, and I think there's some of that happening here as well, where it's much harder for small farmers to make a living, and so the numbers are devastating. Like in the early part of the 19th century, I should memorize these numbers, but 94% of the nation's farmers were small farmers, family farms, and now it's down to like 2%. I mean, it's absolutely devastating, which means that, industries are creating yeast-based slimes in factories based on the monoculture gruel that they're growing across the country, and it's dangerous in many, many ways. And so it's one of the great mistakes that we're learning, that we've all allowed our society to make. And this guy's writing has the most clear point of view. It's so rife with human wisdom, and it all just comes down to focusing on stewardship, of knowing where your food comes from, paying attention to your relationships. It's behaving like human beings did in communities before we had smartphones and Elon Musk and electric scooters. The documentary is called Look and See. It's on Netflix, and oh, it's not on UK Netflix. God damn. I mean, in my lifetime, I can only imagine that we're coming closer and closer to when I release a movie, everybody can see it at the same time. Until then, I apologize. I'm not in charge. I'm still at the whims of those douchebags.
So let's take another question. Yes, remember, just in the aisle.
Hi, Nick. Thank you for coming to speak to us. And I actually started listening to your audiobook with Megan over Christmas, so it's amazing that you're coming so soon after. And I was wondering what it was like recording A Greatest Love Story Ever Told, because it seemed like a really relaxed and funny insight into your dynamic as a couple. And you guys seem to be learning about each other as you're recording after 15 years of marriage. And what's your favorite part of the book?
Well, thank you. There's a few compliments in there, and I appreciate it. This is good. Is anyone in the room married? Wow. Congratulations. I recommend the choice. I have 3 books. I had published 3 books, and Megan, after the second one and the third one, she started saying, we should do a book together. And I would say, okay, what is it? Because my 3 books, I had an agenda that I was passionate about that fueled me for 340 pages. And I love collaborating with Megan, but to just say, let's do a book, I was like, well, sure, but what? What are we telling people? My first book's about farting. My second book is about Wendell Berry. My third book's about woodworking. What is our book about? And finally, and this is the marriage lesson part, I said, okay. And even though it didn't fit into, my ego-based life path and my agenda, that the things I want to disseminate to my readership or my audience, I said, I trust you, I trust your taste and your acumen. And she said, look, the book is just going to be about us. It's going to be sort of a memoir of our marriage. And I was like, all right. I'll go along with it. And we did the book. The idea was we were going to record a bunch of conversations as foundational material. We would transcribe those conversations and then use that to then write these chapters. Well, we got the transcriptions back and we read them and we thought they were funny, first of all, but second, we said, this is it. This is the chapter. Like, we can't improve on this because these conversations contain our dynamic. And how are we going to embellish that by writing and editing? We can't. And so the meat of the book are these conversations on different topics. So one chapter is us talking about family, religion, what have you, orgasms, mainly just lubrication, actually. And then we each wrote a few essays single-handedly, and she's, I've done all this, I've done a great deal more writing than she has, but of course her essays are incredible and brilliant, and I'm a big fan. She's pretty astonishing at whatever she puts her hand to. And so it was a wonderful lesson because it turned out wonderfully, and people are very moved and enlarged by this book, and they learn about things about a healthy relationship. In Hollywood, you're not supposed to be able to stay married for 15 years. We've been together for 18 years, and yet we have a healthy relationship, and we talk about how that requires maintenance. We're two human beings sharing a tube of toothpaste, and that can devolve into slap fights about who left the cap off. Not me. And I was really thrilled with how the book turned out, even now I can't. It doesn't fit into my clumsy. I'm the donkey in our house. And I'm like, this isn't a donkey book, but that's okay. That's a great marriage lesson, that you can get involved in something that's not particularly donkey fare, but it can still be healthy and restorative. My favorite part of the book, each chapter at its heading has a gorgeous photograph. And they were all, Megan designed, I'm telling you, she's astonishing. She designed the book, there's illustrations, all of the art in the book is her brainchild. And I think there's 9 chapters, and each one has a beautiful photo that she designed. And I showed up at a photo studio on the day she told me to, and they gave me funny outfits to put on. And I had no idea, because I learned a long time ago not to weigh in, because that's just frustrating. She has an amazing taste, but she also is very exacting and perfectionist. So there's only pain for me if I was to say, well, I want to be involved. It's our book. And she would say, okay, for this photo, we're going to look like ballet dancers from Russia in the 60s. And I would say, can I have it? She'd say no. And I would say, I'm just going to go wait in the car. I learned that a long time ago. So she said, I'm going to do these photos. And I said, great. Just tell me when to show up. And these photos are gorgeous. They're crazy. We shot 11 of them in one day, because we also did the cover, the book, and the author photo. And once again, there's something to be said for any partnership about swallowing yourself and having the wherewithal to say, okay, let's do what you want. And to not be resentful, and not keep score of like, okay, we did what you wanted last Sunday, so this Sunday we're going to watch West Ham United, God damn it. That's a soccer team. We call it football here. But so that's my favorite part of the book is you know, a healthy marriage is a continuing education. Again, you know, we're two human beings, and so we're never done learning and growing, and whatever we get mad at each other for today, it'll be something different next year, and so you have to keep your knees bent and be ready to play solid defense.
Another question? It's the gentleman in the front row, just here.
So first, as a guy who grew up in rural Vermont, sugaring and woodworking, a lot of what you said resonates a lot. But I've also always found it sort of difficult to move from working with your hands into doing like an academic degree or something else with your mind. So I was just wondering how you balance your various projects along with your woodworking and crafting.
Well, that's a good question. Are you a student here?
Yeah, I'm a DPhil student in medieval studies. So doctoral student.
Fantastic, congratulations.
Well, when it's done.
I'm a big fan of Vermont. Do you know Sterling College?
I do, yeah.
Sterling College, I don't know a great deal about it, but it's a working farm where you can get a degree, but you work on the farm, and they farm with horses, they log with horses, so it's sort of Emersonian in a way, but you can still get an English degree or and they are partnering with Wendell Berry's family with that farming program I mentioned. They're using the accreditation of Sterling College, and it's a new thing. This is their first semester, so that's one of my pet. I do fundraising for them because it's a program to teach small farmers how to try and survive in this modern climate. To answer your question, I always liken my life to a circus act where you're spinning plates, and you got 5-7 plates that you got to keep spinning. And when Parks and Recreation became popular, my life changed drastically. At the time, before it happened, I was more successful than I ever thought I would be. I was Mr. Megan Mullally, which was a wonderful gig. I had my wood shop in LA, and I was working consistently as an unknown character actor, and then doing theater and whatnot. So I was always very busy, but then when Parks and Rec happened, suddenly, a shift happened where I was being offered all of these jobs, the kind of jobs you would think you can't say no to. And I spent a few years failing to say no to them. And so I just 24/7 all year was working all kinds, writing books, touring as a comedian, doing acting jobs, working in my wood shop. And it was fun and lucrative, but pretty quickly both my wife and I said, well, this is kind of bullshit. This is an embarrassment of riches. It's too much of a good thing. And I've sort of heard people talk about this, and it's something, nothing in my experience has ever been able to prepare me for it. It's if you achieve the success that you dreamed of, and maybe even more success than you dreamed of, then what do you do? And because that becomes your problem. Sort of my vice, my indulgence became saying yes to too many of these things. And so this was about the time that I decided to write my third book, which is called Good, Clean Fun, and it's a woodworking book. And that was my solution, was I told all of the people in all the machinations, my agents and my wife, I guess that's everybody. I said, I'm going to do this book with my wood shop, and I'm going to need 4 months in the shop, and you can all go to hell. And because it was going to make income, ostensibly, I was allowed. And so that's the answer is, if you're lucky enough to, to have a program of study at this incredible establishment, it's university is what they call it, and also have whatever else you have going on in your life. I assume that you're rowing crew, and you want to get some woodworking in there, you have to call it out. One of the most wonderful things about playing Ron Swanson was when the show looked like it was going to continue, my boss said, and this is funny, if you've seen The Office, if you go back and look at the first 6 episodes, Steve Carell had a bunch more weight on him, and he was also kind of balding. And the show got picked up, and he was like, "Oh shit!" And he got in shape, and I don't know what he did. And I love Steve, and I'm a huge fan. I mean, I don't mean to disparage him at all, but like, it's a great example of he was like, "Oh, I'm going to be the lead on a TV show," so he cleaned himself up, and it paid off. He became a huge movie star 15 minutes later. Because of that, Parks and Recreation was born of The Office. So Mike Schur, who created our show with Greg Daniels, that came from The Office. Fun fact: if you like The Office, Dwight Schrute had a cousin named Mose Schrute out on the beet farm with that Amish beard. That's Mike Schur, who created Parks and Recreation. Mose, who like runs alongside the car. So when our show got picked up, because of The Office, Mike said, "Hey, please don't lose a bunch of weight." To me specifically. He said, I would appreciate it if you stay beefy. I really like for Ron to look like a meat eater, and it's in this town of anorexia, it's one of the most wonderful things your boss could ever ask you to do. And so for 7 or 8 years, I would always happily order that second cheeseburger because I was being a good employee. I was willing to do that for my work, and then once that ended, I started at 38, and I guess I finished at about 45 years old, 44. Then the show was over, and I was like, okay, I'm overweight. I'm 44, and all the things I was getting offered were like ex-rugby player, 50 pounds past his prime, in his briefs, crying in the mirror. And I thought I'd like to see a little more variety in the roles that are coming my way, and so I started cleaning up my diet, and I trimmed off 20 pounds, and then a couple years ago, I'm coming back around to my point, which is I said I'm the boss of everything I do. I write books, I do all these things. And I'm the boss of all of it. It's all what I choose to do. And I love exercising. I was always an athlete. I spent some years doing yoga. That's another huge difference between me and Ron Swanson. Yoga is amazing. Like, I'll fucking tell him that any day. But since I got so busy, I never had time to exercise. And I said, wait a second, I'm in charge of this whole goddamn thing. And so a couple years ago, I said, you know what, I'm going to start running for the first time in my life. And I did. I went out that day and I started running, and I haven't stopped. I run every day. I run 4 miles a day usually, and I lost another 20 pounds. And so that's the answer is choosing long-term goodness over short-term gratifications, And it comes with age. I mean, when I was in college, I was getting shit-faced as much as possible, but your bodies are much more bulletproof. And, I think it's a good time to sort of find those limits and see if you're going to be a partying college student or a lifelong alcoholic, and begin to deal with the repercussions of either. At the same time, woodworking is something that requires usually a specific space. It's an activity that you need to go to a place, even if it's a small space. You can't just like set up on your kitchen table. But on this subject matter, I often encourage people who say, like, I live in a tiny apartment in the middle of London or New York, and I say, well, either look into turning small things like pens or small bowls. Like there is woodworking you can do in this much space, or learn to make dildos or, some of the other options I mentioned.
So I think we've got time for one final question. And let's go to the lady in the third row. Yeah.
Hi, so I'm actually from rural Kentucky, and it's always been a pleasure to hear somebody speak positively about my state for once. So first, thanks for that.
Amen.
Yeah, and then also kind of being from rural Kentucky and being here, I just want to ask you about like what you think about the American psyche, about rural-urban divide, and how can we get past that, because it seems like right now it's such a divisive force. I mean, even me being here, I'm all the time talking about home and like telling people that it's not all, podunk people, I wear shoes, things like that. So how do we get past this divide?
Well, it's a great question. In the sort of Wendell Berry of it all, that's part of it, is so much of our population has moved and continues to flock to urban centers, and when there's a vicious circle where the huge industrial companies farm acres that say you're farming 100 acres 50 years ago, let's say that required 8 people. Now it requires 1/4 of a person. Like one person can farm 2,000 acres or whatever, and so it's no longer lucrative, it no longer requires a community, and so the young people either move to a city to find a way to make money, or if they stay home, that's where the opioid crisis kicks in. They get hooked on usually video games and opioids. I'm very anti-video game. But I don't know. I mean, that's a huge question and a huge issue. I'm just starting my next book, and what I'm trying to tackle is the notion, the concept. I don't think this will be the title, but the concept is Walden now, and it's how we as a society relate to nature, or how we fail to, which ties into all these issues of, do you know where your food comes from? Do you have any idea where wood comes from? Do you know who's making your stuff? How can we be expected to respect and take care of our climate when we never pay attention to nature herself? We've built all of these mechanisms to shield ourselves from nature. We have an idea that anything that gets your clothing dirty is beneath us. And so, we need to pave everything so that you don't soil yourself, or any work, God forbid, that gets dirt on your clothes. That, you hire people to do that. You should you should go to Oxford and keep yourself from ever having to dig in the garden. You get people from Illinois to do that for you. But you know, it's that sensibility that we've been sold by consumerist society that I think I'm optimistic that we are realizing as a people, and we're like, okay, how do we start breaking this down and cleaning up this mess that we've made? And it seems to be taking root. I'm excited by the forward-thinking Green New Deal policies that are cropping up and making a splash in this new American Congress. It's been such an incredible shit show the last couple of years. But in a way, and I even said this, there's a wonderful actress named Ellen Burstyn who's in her 80s, and I worked on a couple films with her around the campaign and when Trump got elected, and she said, "This is going to be very good for us. It's going to be terrifying and dangerous, but it's going to slap us out of the sort of comfort that we've been riding along in. You know, we elected Obama and said, great, racism has been solved." And we really, I think that really is true. And suddenly, Trump's regime has exposed all of the issues that have such a long way to go, even in our two ostensibly most progressive countries. And so that's very much on my mind, and that's a question that I'm asking of myself and the rest of us. And again, I implore you, study hard and answer these questions. Let's all answer them together. And I'm happy to hang out for a few more questions if you guys are not bored yet. I came all the way from Notting Hill.
Any other questions? Take the one hand in there. Yeah.
Hello, Nick. I wanted to thank you for your time here at the Union, and I wanted to ask you what kind of advice would you have for young people looking to get into woodworking?
Is that Rowan?
Yes. Yes.
Ask your question again, Rowan.
I just wanted to know what kind of advice you would have for young people looking to get into woodworking.
Rowan served me tea earlier this evening. It was delicious.
Thank you.
Well, it's a great question because it seemed really easy to me, but I accidentally had 15 years of carpentry training, so I was skilled with tools when I discovered woodworking. But the trick to anything is, the answer is the same as if you want to learn to play piano, and the key to it is you have to practice a tedious amount of time to learn to play piano or guitar, and the way to achieve that is to find something that you can enjoy playing 1,000 times. I mentioned the Beatles earlier. They have some very catchy melodies that might serve you. But the great thing about the internet is that if you want to become a blacksmith, you can find all the information and instruction and ingredients and tools no matter where you are. You can get everything you need. Nothing will ever replace the efficacy of a human hand teaching you. I've had one class in woodworking in my life. When I was in Boston doing that play, there's an incredible trade school there that's 2.5 centuries old, which is quite eldritch for America. And this hero of mine named Peter Galbert, he makes Windsor chairs. And it just so happened that he was teaching a week-long workshop while I was there. And I was able to take it, and it was the only time in my life that I've had a teacher that I'm self-taught, which means from books and some videos, but mostly books. And there's a tool called a draw knife, and you have pieces of oak, and you're holding them in what's called a shaving horse. So it's this clamping vise with a piece of wood, and you're shaving off pieces of this oak. And he was just going around like any coach, like any sports coach, talking to us about our fundamentals and improving our technique in a way that if I was trying to learn this on my own, even from a video, he was just saving me weeks of mistakes. I started crying. I said, oh my God, like my mom or dad or a grandparent who takes the time to say, hang on, whatever technique that they're improving for you. And so get online, look around. I'm certain that in the general Oxford neighborhood, there are probably an embarrassment of great woodworkers and classes that you can take. You just can't beat hands-on instruction. That said, the modern disease causes us to always look for the fastest, coolest way to do things. That's part of consumerism. And so when you get into woodworking, it's a common joke that if you start shopping at woodworking stores, there's always a new gadget. There's always a time-saving, this great new jig that with this really loud, dangerous motor, you can do things in 9/10 of the time. And it usually ends up not even being true. If you're good with hand tools, you're usually just as fast as with electricity in most applications. So I always encourage people to just start reading, looking at publications, because you'll see that there are many aspects. It's like saying, what's your advice for getting into writing? Well, what do you want to write? So start looking at stuff, because maybe you want to turn bowls, maybe you want to build chairs, maybe you want to make dildos. If you do make sex toys of any sort, just make sure you sand them really effectively, because splinters can cause lawsuits, I say from experience.
Is that from personal experience?
Take another question. To the hand on the front row. There.
Hello. We stand up for these, apparently. Okay. Hi, thank you for coming today. I had a question about kind of borrowing your words from earlier about the turd that is in office right now in America. And I was wondering if you thought your show, Parks and Rec, if it happened right now, do you think it would have a different place in meaning in the social climate of what's going on, political? Do you think it would have a different character in the eyes of the people who watched it if it happened right now?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, one funny thing, and my wife being on Will and Grace is, it's interesting that we've had two very effective television comedies in our household. And I don't know if those of you that aren't from Vermont or Kentucky, there's a term in American baseball. There's a young male or female called the bat boy or ball girl, and they like hang out by the dugout, and it's a great gig because you get to hang out with a professional team, and you're sort of a equipment manager. You take care of everybody's bats and whatnot. I've always felt like the bat boy for Will and Grace, because I'm always there watching them perform their incredible gymnastics. And so I've been there for, since they're back. I've been seeing 18 years of that show. And the tricky thing is, because of the metabolism of making such a show, if something is in the news, whether it's a Muslim ban or a government shutdown over a wall or whatever, you can't really write stories that are that time specific, because by the time your story airs, it's going to be at least 2 or 3 months later. And for all you know, the story can have changed drastically. So you have to be pretty analogous, if anything, or allegorical. And so I think that, I'm sure that we would have had some storylines that were, that had to do with like alternative facts and the way that this administration is sort of destroying and redefining levels of comportment and decency in politics in our country. And we may even have had some sort of huge blowhard character, but I think generally Mike Schur, who was Mose and created Parks and Rec, he also his main gig right now is The Good Place, is his show, and so you can sort of see the relationship that he's interested in creating comedy that explores ethics, and asks questions about like how are we being decent to one another, or how are we failing to do so, and how can we improve that? And I imagine we would, do the same thing with slightly different storylines.
And let's take one final question. Let's come to the hand down here, please.
Hi. Hello. I'd just like to know about your early acting career, from training into getting your jobs where you can make a living from that. Obviously, you can read a lot on the internet and stuff like that, but I'd like to hear from the horse's mouth himself how that journey was. Was it a seamless affair, or was it a hard? You've touched on it slightly already, but I'd just like to know in a bit more detail if you can.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting because it's the answer to your question you can't really read about because nobody gives a shit about all the work you do until you get to do things that people care about. And that's the crux, is crossing that bridge. Are there theater majors at Oxford? It's been great talking to you. Thanks very much. You should check them out; they're fun. So I went to theater school. I've always been very aware of the great fortune that I benefit from. I auditioned for what was a very nice theater conservatory, and they only took 16 actors a year in this program, and it was the first time I auditioned for anything. I mean, I was just a hilarious rube when I went to audition. In fact, I got the materials that told you what you had to do, and it said to prepare 2 contrasting monologues. So one monologue was from The Elephant Man. It's completely nonsensical. I'm sure no one has ever. It was the doctor describing Edward Merrick's deformities. Like, it was a ridiculous choice. And my second monologue was a scene of dialogue from this 70s play called Steam Bath. And so for a monologue in an audition, I did a scene. I did both parts of a scene. I was like, yeah, welcome to the Steam Bath. Thank you. Can I sit right? Yeah, come on in. And then you had to write an essay and be interviewed. And so I wrote this very sincere essay that just said, look, I I'm completely ignorant. I'm an absolute babe in the woods, but I'm really hardworking, and I really just want to do great theater. And what I learned later, so then I got in, I was one of the 16, and what I figured out then, as I went through the program, and they refused to cast me, I couldn't get a part. And there would be parts that I was clearly perfect, like specific roles, and I was much cuter then, and I was a football player, and so there was a few roles where I was like, boom, that's mine. And there was one part that they actually like recruited a guy from another school, and I was like, man, what is the deal? But at the same time, I kind of knew that it was because I was really bad. I hadn't figured out the secret to naturalism, which is just act natural. I spent my first 5 or 6 years theater school into Chicago, just trying too hard. I unconsciously thought that this small town guy didn't have any value, was uninteresting. I had to be way cooler. And so when I would do scenes, I would just try way too hard. I'd be like, what's up? I'm pretty fucking cool here in this play. And when it finally clicked, the sun came out, I was like, oh man, I'm gonna do great. But so what I figured out is, even in a conservatory, you're gonna do Shakespeare plays, you need people in those plays to carry the leads on stage, in like Antony and Cleopatra. You need supernumeraries, and if they're strong and can carry things, so much the better. So that's how I got into school. Then I got into Chicago theater, and the thing is, and I'm sure this is true in a lot of all of the United Kingdom, you can make a perfectly decent living working in theater. Where you're not living in poverty, you're making just a perfectly nice living. And in Chicago, there's a wonderful theater community, and there's probably 12 cities in America where that's true, where you can make a living. And so I had a wonderful time. I lived through my 20s. I built scenery for pay, and I worked in plays at night. And then I got cast in a couple movies, because sometimes movies come to Chicago or Liverpool or Northampton. And I got into a couple movies. I got my union card, and everybody said, you should move to LA. You've got a great mug, is what they said. You'll do well. And I had a tooth that needed fixing. And I had heard of this SAG dental insurance, Screen Actors Guild. And so I moved to LA to get my molar fixed. And it took me a couple years of age like 28 and 29 where I couldn't figure it out. I arrived to discover that the business was even more disgusting than people say. It's just really superficial. Like, I was getting cool meetings, but with people, they weren't merit-based meetings. Like, I had a really good theater resume, and they didn't even know how to read it. They were like, do you have anything on tape? This is the late 90s, so we're not online. YouTube isn't there yet. So literally, they're like, do you have something I can put in my VCR and watch? And I didn't. I was like, no, but look at my theater resume. It's very substantial. And they were like, I don't know what language you're speaking. And my friends would say, no, these are these meetings where you have to convince them that you have the X factor, that you're cool and sexy, and that they need to get you on a development deal, because otherwise you're going to go across town to the other studio and they have to get you first. And I was like, that's bullshit. People hire me because they see my work. I don't want to sell myself. I don't want to have to be cool in any way. And so I did that for a couple of years, and I was quite lost. I was casting about, drinking way too much bourbon, looking for, and that was when I discovered woodworking, in fact. I was just working all the time on my own carpentry work. And finally, after a couple of years, I said, okay, LA is a much worse town for theater than Chicago was, but I became a man in so much as I was at the time by doing theater. And so I just have to find a play and do a play. I have to save myself, otherwise I'm going to probably end up failing and moving back to Chicago. So I told all my friends. They found this weird play, this East German breakdancing soldier who had a monologue comparing his phallus to his anus. And they said, "It's right, it's you." And and I went in and I auditioned, and the lead of the play was Megan Mullally, and we fell in love, and she saved my life. And that was it. And this is, I'm going to turn this into a general truism. I had dinner last night with a great director named Douglas McKinnon. He's directed Sherlock and Outlander and things like that. He's just finishing directing a Neil Gaiman series for Amazon called Good Omens that I have a small part in, which is how we became friends. And we were talking about this inscrutable thing. No matter what field you're going into, when you're doing an interview or an audition or trying to get that thing that you want so badly that you feel a desperation. And in acting, especially in Los Angeles, if you're broke and you're having a tough time paying your rent, you go to these auditions for a TV show where if it works, you're literally signing papers that say, if you get this job, you're going to make, 35 grand a week. Like, Jesus Christ. And the trick is to then go in the room and behave in a way. It's so hard to not go in the room and be like, "Hi." If you could please love me, that would be great. And people tell you this, they're like, if you want to get the job, you stand a much better chance if you don't give a shit. Because if you can arrive at the sensibility that whatever the opportunity is, whatever your field is, if it's some great honor or huge, goal or prize, it doesn't matter. You have to hold it against your life. And so it has to be a choice. So you go into audition for that 35 grand a week or whatever, and you have to hold that against your life and understand that it could go either way. It's probably not going to go your way. But even if it does, you still have to think about it. And that simple power, if you walk into the room, and it's not being cocky or anything, it's just like a naturalism where you're saying, "Hello, I'm Nick. This is me. Hopefully you understand that I'm friendly. I'm professional. I'm prepared. I'm going to do my best. I know I'm going to give you a solid reading. Maybe I won't be right in some way, but if they can tell that you don't give a shit if you get it or not, it's inscrutable. It makes them want you." There's a similar analogy in furniture. When I started making tables for people in LA, I didn't know what to charge. Making these beautiful, museum quality custom tables. And I don't mean that as a brag, because my specialty is to take one slice of a tree and put it on what's called a trestle base. It doesn't have a high degree of difficulty. You're sort of getting out of Mother Nature's way. But when you look at a slice of a walnut tree, it's museum quality. And it's only because I have the wherewithal to let Mother Nature do the talking. But I know how long it took me to make it. And so, if I charge myself, $25 an hour, it comes out to, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000. And I would think, what kind of asshole would pay $8,000 for a dining table? I can't. And so when I started out, I was charging people like something that I felt okay about, $1,500, $2,500. And Rainn Wilson, who was an old friend who played Dwight Schrute, he called me up and he wanted a thick-ass Gustav Stickley arts and crafts style white oak table for his family room, his kitchen. And I said, great. And I drew him the table and I sent it to him. And he said, okay, what's this going to cost? And I said, yeah, $5,500. And he said, you asshole, I've been shopping for these tables. How about $10,000? And I said, I cry a lot. That's another difference. Ron Swanson has cried 3 times. I cry all the time. But I mean, that was such a moving and generous lesson that he gave me. And the trick is, and I've learned this in the fancy furniture shops, is if you charge $1,500, people are going to think something's wrong with it or you. If you charge $15,000 and they only have $12,000 to spend, they're going to think that's the best goddamn table they've ever seen, and they're more likely to pay 10 times the price. Isn't that crazy? But it's all part of the same thing. It's a great human lesson, and that's how I finally got to the place where I was able to walk into these rooms and understand that this might not go my way today, but I've created a life with my wife and my home and my wood shop that I'm happy all the time, and maybe sometime I'll get a good acting job, but regardless, I will. What's the deal with that? Is irregardless is not a word? Is that the thing? Okay. I'm seeing some nods. I'm down. I've used it, but I'm going to stop. See, we can all learn. Regardless, if you make your life happy, which you can do by baking bread, giving one another orgasms with your hands, and then eating bread, then you can be happy no matter what happens at all of your auditions. Thank you for your kind indulgence this evening.